Brazil's economic activity rose sharply in January, a central bank index showed on Monday, indicating that Latin America's largest economy has not only recovered all its pandemic-related decline, but is now back to the size it was over 5 years ago. Official data also shows the economy created more than 250,000 formal jobs at the start of the year, the strongest growth in January since comparable records began in 1992. In contrast to this, the country's president, Jair Bolsonaro, is facing mounting pressure and public anger over his government's handling of the coronavirus crisis. Brazil has reported 11.5 million COVID-19 cases and more than 279,000 deaths to date. The government has just appointed its fourth health minister since the start of the pandemic, and its health service is on the brink of collapse. To discuss this, I'm now being joined by Paulo Levy, a macroeconomics researcher at the Institute of Applied Economic Research. He joins me from Rio de Janeiro. Paulo Levy, thanks for joining me on Channel's Business Global. Some pretty decent economic data has come out of the central bank showing that growth could potentially be at pre-pandemic levels. We also then on Tuesday got a report suggesting that the amount of people that are entering the job market is also at accelerated growth. What do you think is driving this activity?
Well, I think there are two factors that determine this performance. The first one is that industrial production has been pulling growth up due to a change in the consumer patterns of demand that switched from services consumption into the consumption of goods. This is something that we have seen elsewhere in the world with industrial production leading growth and even offsetting the negative effects of services production, which has been hardly hit by the pandemics and the need for people to be in social isolation. So this is one factor. Industrial production is responding to that. The other thing is because of government programs transferring income to families affected by the pandemics, particularly those of low income levels, you were able to maintain demand. And even if activity has been affected, especially in the services sector. So you also have people maintaining somehow their consumption and changing it into the consumption of goods, buying electronics, buying things for their houses, and other things like that, somehow replacing the consumption of services. They go less to restaurants or they don't travel any longer. So this is all combining to produce a good performance in the economy. And the industrial sector is also a sector that hires workers on a more formal way, workers obeying the labor legislation and so on. So that's why you're seeing, because of the increase in manufacturing labor demand, you're seeing this good performance in the labor market.
Absolutely. Thank you for mentioning the fiscal stimulus. I wanted to ask you about what potentially the next set of fiscal stimulus will look like, because, you know, you can't talk about economic activity in 2021 and not talk about the elephant in the room, which is COVID-19. We've seen new stimulus measures just signed into Congress by Joe Biden. We also saw early this month the British government extending some of their economic stimulus for people who have been struggling. What are we going to be expecting from Brazil? Because we know you are witnessing a second wave of COVID spread, aren't you?
Yes, the fiscal space for implementing additional programs of income transfer to families are very small. Brazil has already entered into the pandemic, started with very high deficit levels, fiscal deficit levels, and also a very high debt to GDP ratio. So there isn't much fiscal space. A lot has been done last year in terms of, as I mentioned before, transferring income to the most vulnerable parts of society, those people more involved in informal activities. But currently, the scope for additional programs is much smaller. In fact, the government has approved a program last week in the Congress that is much smaller than what you had last year, about one-fourth of what you had last year. And the idea is that this time the program will be much more focused on the people that really need it.
Brazil is under the spotlight at the moment, especially the president. We know there's an election next year. There are lots of issues when it comes to the handling of the pandemic. I know you're just going to be appointing your fourth health minister in about a year. There's lots of discussions about the environment. I know race issues remains a major issues, as well as corruption. How is, Brazilians, how are they coping at the moment? And what is the mood on the ground right now?
Well, the elections next year certainly have an effect currently because politicians, political groups are, let's say, searching for alliances and probing the ground as regards as what candidates we might have and so on. So the fact that we're going to have elections next year will have an effect on the political framework that we face today. There's debate in Brazil, as there are in other countries, regarding the way the government has been facing the pandemics, regarding the health ministry actions in supporting state and local governments in their efforts to fight back pandemics, to provide medical assistance to those that need. And maybe the main criticism currently has to do with the fact that Brazil might have waited a bit longer than would be necessary to acquire vaccines, so that we are coming to the market at a moment that there is strong demand pressure upon producers of vaccines, international laboratories that produce the vaccines. But gradually, the government has been increasing the number of vaccines contracted while we are in the middle of a more serious situation regarding the number of cases, regarding the number of deaths, number of people needing treatment in hospitals. But as the vaccine program advances, I believe that the situation will gradually normalize.
Thank you so much, Paulo Levy, macroeconomics researcher at the IPEA. Thank you so much for joining me on Channels Business Global.
Thank you for the opportunity. Goodbye.